Dot University's Personal Insurance Part 1 lecture series. My name is Richard Okamoto, and I will be your guide through this amazing and incredible journey through personal insurance. You know, Dot University has a specific framework from which it teaches and instructs. And that framework starts with first presenting a landscape view of the subject matter. That means, if you can imagine, it's like flying over New York City. And all you see are these buildings down below you, but you can see the outline of the city. You can see the Hudson River. But if you want to see the details, what really makes a city tick, you can dive right down, smooth basically as silk, see the buildings, and be a part of them. Those we call building blocks. So the Dot University approach combines an overview or landscape so you can see everything and how it works, and then deep dives into the building blocks. Well, we've talked about the landscape approach from the Dot University, and we mentioned the core building blocks. With personal insurance, there's 4 primary building blocks. The first is management of risk. The second is personal risk. And the third is property risk. And lastly, on the fourth, is liability risk. When we look at those 4 building blocks for personal insurance, management of risk is really first understanding what is risk. When we look at the other 3 building blocks, the next one being personal risk, that really relates to our ability to not lose our earning capabilities. The third, property risk, really relates to the personal risk of losing or the damaging of our personal property. And the fourth, liability risk, is really looking at how do we protect ourselves from others. We will break personal insurance down into 2 sections. In this first section, part 1, we'll cover the first 2 building blocks, management of risk and personal risk. In part 2 of personal insurance, we'll cover property risk and liability risk. So let's talk about risk a little bit. That's the first building block in personal insurance. You know, dealing with risk, there's a lot of different methods to look at. You know, people say, well, okay, how do you deal with risk? Well, one way is you can avoid it. You can say, I'm just not going to go there. If there's a hole in the ground, there's a big pothole, do you drive over it? No, you can avoid it. You can avoid the risk of getting a flat tire. Another way to look at risk is maybe you can just reduce it. For example, if you see that same pothole in the road, maybe what you can do is, I'll put a little board over it and I can reduce the risk that I'll drive over a big pothole. So you can avoid it, you can reduce it. Another way is you can just accept it and say, you know what, no matter what happens, I'm going to drive right over that pothole, and if I get a flat tire, so be it. But then there's the fourth, and that's sharing the risk. And that's what insurance is about. It's really about sharing the risk. The second building block we talked about is personal risk. And it really stems down to protecting our ability to generate cash flow. If you recall, there's the GAP process or approach for financial well-being. GAP standing for generating, accumulating, and protecting. Protecting what? Our assets, protecting our cash flow, protecting the accumulation of financial assets. Well, that's what insurance does. It's the big P in GAP, protecting. So when we look at personal risks, what are we looking at? Protecting our ability to generate cash flow. And one of those key ingredients for that is healthcare. You know, in addition to healthcare protecting our ability to generate cash flow, the other part of personal risk is if bad things happen, very bad things. And to protect us there, protect our cash flow and accumulated wealth, we have to look at personal insurance. That's the other aspect which we'll talk about in detail with regards to personal risk. So what does risk look like? I mean, we can think that everything's risky or it's not risky. But for the purposes of insurance, risk looks like this. Wherever there's the opportunity for an adverse financial condition or event to take place, risk is present. And then we go back and we ask ourselves, do we want to avoid it, reduce it, potentially just accept it, or do we want to share it? But that's what risk looks like. Wherever there's a potential financial adverse condition that can happen. So what does personal insurance look like? Well, if you can imagine, in the old days, let's say you're in a farming community and your barn burns down. They used to call that basically a barn raising. All your neighbors would come out, they'd help out. Some of them would buy the lumber, some of them would buy the nails, but they would all come together and they would help build your barn. They would actually share the cost of your barn that had burned down. Well, insurance looks very similar to that. Insurance is really two key attributes to it. Those two key attributes that insurance shares are, one, the loss is shared amongst a lot of people, and two, that loss is shared ratably over those people. So just like raising that barn back in the old days and everybody sharing the cost, that's what insurance does now in these modern times. Well, now that we've had the opportunity to take a look at the landscape of personal insurance and introduce the 4 building blocks of insurance, and now that we know under this part 1, we'll be looking at or investigating risk management or management of risk and personal risk. Why don't we go ahead and take a step forward and do a deep dive into the first building block, which is management of risk.